You guys are so well trained, you sat down, you were ready to go. Dan, even you. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to attend the town board meeting when Imagine Amherst was brought up, but I understand it was well received. And Ellen, thank you for your remarks. They're very appropriate. It was very nice of you. Unfortunately, I couldn't get there that evening because I was still a little under the weather, but I understand from Mr. Black that everything went pretty well. You agree, Ramona?
I would say yes and no. Yes, that in fact, I think Duncan and Ellen were there and spoke to it. There were other people who spoke, still concerned about the process or whatever, but as far as the Imagine Amherst itself, you know, when people ask me about it, I said it's redeveloping the commercial areas to make it more suitable for the neighborhood they're in, just very simply. And I think that's what we've been working on for the past, how many months since you go last February. So, but there's still concerns about public input and whatever, but I think we've tried. But I think when people understand what we're really doing here, that hopefully it will have a favorable outcome. So.
Yeah, it's interesting too because I've talked to a couple of people who have a different perception than what we've actually worked on. And also, a couple of people that have been to meetings sporadically or only to one meeting walk away with not necessarily the impression of everything that we're trying to accomplish. You really have to have participated in this almost from the beginning to understand where we're at this point. If you didn't, you can walk away with a different impression than what's really going on. So, anyhow. Okay, I hope that all of you had an opportunity to look at the notes from the last meeting. And are there any corrections, additions, deletions, changes that need to be made? Yes, ma'am.
Just a little typo. In the paragraph, the second paragraph starting with Lee's name, the new graphics will specifically, I think it was meant to say represent rather than representing.
Okay. See that?
Yep, I've got it.
All right. Thank you. All right. So let's get right into the discussion of the zoning concepts with Lori and Dan.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully, you've all received a copy of the information that looks like this. It's called mixed-use center zoning that Lee brought with him during his visit last month. That's the basis for our discussion tonight. Just to give you a little insight into where we are, as Dal mentioned and Ramona alluded to, the town board did hold their hearing on the comp plan amendment at their last meeting. There is an opportunity for folks to provide written comments on the draft through the end of this week, and then we'll take those comments and we'll be working with those to formulate responses and complete the final generic environmental impact statement for the town board's consideration at their meeting on the 20th, I believe, of this month. Got that date right. So that process is moving along. What we'd like to do tonight, just based on the information that Lee provided the last time, and maybe you've had a chance to consider some of that between then and now, but we'd like to walk you through some of the concepts that are identified in this handout, help you to maybe understand a little bit better what those concepts mean and how they might differ between the suburban and the traditional context. Really, this is an opportunity to get people acquainted with the terminology, acquainted with the concepts, and maybe, hopefully, help you to think a little bit more critically about what these are and how they might be formed when we actually get to the zoning code review. I anticipate, I know you probably heard this before, but I anticipate, based on a conversation with the consultant this afternoon, that we should have a full version of the code to begin to look at the middle of next month or so. What you've seen so far are just some examples of the different districts that might apply under the different forms, and we haven't even fully received the different types yet. So you've got a sample of what we're going to get. We'll have that hopefully next month. The staff will have an opportunity to look at it. Rick said he's going to spend Christmas Eve waiting for Santa Claus and reading the draft zoning code, so good luck with that. But we'll, yeah. So we'll have a look at it, and then we'll bring it to the committee to begin discussions on the draft code. So that gives you a little idea where we're going right now. Dal will discuss later what the schedule might be in the near term. So with that, I'm going to ask Lori Stillwell, who's been spending quite a bit of time going through these concepts, has a pretty good understanding of them already from her previous experiences, and has a very critical, insightful eye on these. So she's going to walk us through the terms and the concepts a little bit. And I think this should be more of a discussion if we can. I think she's going to identify the concept, talk a little bit about it, and then provide an opportunity for us to discuss what those concepts mean, and again, how they might differ in the suburban or traditional context. So, Lori?
Thanks. So I'm going to go right through, and you can follow along in your document. I'm going to go in order of the document, so if you want to follow along that way. This first slide I'm actually going to skip a little bit because there's some highlighted areas in your text on lot area, lot width, and building coverage. This is a placeholder. We talked to Lee earlier today. He's going to get us block standards. We were asking about how, what we're going to do as far as, the setup of a lot area or lot width in terms of subdivision for large lots, maybe like the Boulevard Mall area if they brought up for subdivision. And Lee said a lot of that will be dictated in the coming block standards that we'll see. So I'm going to skip. Okay, so the next concept is building setbacks. We're introducing a number of setbacks here. Primary street obviously is pretty self-explanatory. Side street setbacks. Common side, that's any lot line that is not your primary rear or side street lot line. And then there's rear alley side setbacks. The setbacks are going to be applied to both principal and accessory buildings. And there's also a batch of separate parking setbacks that you'll see as we go along. Buffers and transitions, I do want to note. Yeah.
I'm gonna encourage anybody here that doesn't know what she's referring to when we start throwing around terms like lot lines and alleys and setbacks and things. Please don't hesitate to ask, and we'll try and drill down a little bit if we think that's a concept that maybe needs a little more explanation. So go ahead.
So the buffer and transition that Lee has talked about a number of times do not count towards the setback distances. And you can see from the kind of image that's up there and in your booklet, the building footprint would be the shaded purpley pink area. And then those setbacks are kind of the measured distances off of the right-of-way line that you see around the lot. Want to go to the next one? Okay, so go ahead.
How would, like the landscaping and all that be determined? What is that?
The landscaping's going to apply into the setback distances. So they'll fit within those areas, and in areas where the landscaping requires some additional distance, that might be something where it pushes the setback further.
So the type of landscaping to give whatever's behind that more privacy. What when is in the process is that determined? Is that at the planning board stage or?
Is that at site plan?
That would be.
When is the landscaping?
To encourage, privacy or whatever, was whatever is, on the next property, whether it's a home or what, how is it determined that there will be privacy? That's at the planning board?
At what stage of the
Development, right. So that would be at the planning board stage, or?
It'll be defined in the transitions as well. Yeah. Further in the document. From my understanding, Ramona, just looking at this quickly, there's going to be a section primarily on transitions where we have, unlike land uses, commercial versus residential, and that's where there'll be some definition as to vegetative screening, depth of vegetative screening, quantity, but it's towards the back of what was created so far.
But right, yeah, let me comment on that. There's a very extensive section in the existing zoning code on various types of buffering between dissimilar uses. And I'm assuming here that what's going to happen is that we're going to take another look at those as they apply to the provisions that are being proposed now and make modifications to them so they fit seamlessly into these new provisions. And that's something which I'm assuming is going to happen later on in the code development process. And I had a comment of my own as well here. When we got into the section about the Build 2 zone and setbacks, there's a number of citations here where it says that the planning director has discretion in terms of making determinations as to what particular provisions apply where, particularly for things like irregular lots. I think we need to take a careful look at that. That's normally within the purview of the building commissioner, and I'd be very careful about taking that out of his or her responsibilities. I think there are some opportunities where the planning director might be engaged in this, but for the most part, I think we need to be very careful as to where we do that.
And those are the type of things that I think we're trying to catch in this really initial draft, is those little edits that need to happen of how, based on our town's procedures and how those function.
One more similar comment. When these amendments are finalized, is there going to be a sort of a scrub of the entire code so that usage is the same? Because I believe there's new terminology in here that we don't use in the code today.
Well, if you're talking about a scrub of the additional code, there's going to be a process by which these new provisions are fit into the existing code so that any conflicting language is eliminated. And it was one more thought on that because of your insightful comment, I forgot what it was.
Well, just as an example, Build 2 zone I don't think is a term that we use today in the code.
No.
So
no, it's
is
not.
there a similar term?
I'll let go of this thing soon. Yeah, there's a number of definitions, going through this, a number of definitions that do not exist in the code, and my assumption is that when we get to that point, that we're going to go back and redefine some of these terms which are not used in the existing code.
One other comment on that. There is a task in the scope of work that includes a review of the existing code throughout the code, both to identify terminology that needs to be coordinated and synchronized, and identify concepts in the current code that may need to be updated or upgraded a little bit to accommodate some of this new terminology and new concepts that we're talking about. So that is a task in the scope of work.
Okay. So Build 2 zone, as Gary had said, is not something that we use right now in our code. So we'll be switching from a setback to dictating more of an area within which the building facade must be located. So in the diagram, that's the blue shaded area. You'll see in the districts later on that it's a tighter area or a smaller area, should it be a traditional frontage or traditional zone, and it's a bigger range or area when you get to suburban style development. There's also a percentage Build 2 requirement. This is measured based on the width of the facade in the Build 2 zone, or by the number of buildings divided by the width of the lot. So this is kind of telling you how much of the building has to be, the facade of the building has to be in that Build 2 zone if you had an L-shaped building or a oddly shaped building.
Can I comment on that?
Mm-hmm.
When I read through, and this is on page 4-8, at the top of the page in the upper left-hand corner, it's item 5. I read through that at least 3 times, and I'm not really sure exactly what it said. So I think that maybe have the consultant take another whack at that in a way that makes it a little more understandable. If I don't understand it, I think that the neophyte user of the code, using that language, would have a very difficult time determining what exactly it said.
And are you referring to number 5, the corner lot overlap?
That's correct.
Okay. So one of the other things I want to bring up too in the provisions is that if you need a drive access and you have a small lot, your percentage of build to can be reduced for small lots. Basically, the code is allowing for drive access to rear parking or for fire code and access. The percentage of build to also applies to the minimum height of the building for the district. Right now, minimum height isn't applied anywhere. We haven't really discussed any of that, but if the town would so choose in certain areas to apply a minimum height, you can dictate, if it's a 2-story minimum height, both stories would have to be within that percentage built to. So this is kind of getting to what Rick had just mentioned. The corner lots, this provision kind of goes into, we can ask Lee to clarify this, but it's talking about how if you're on a corner lot, you need to overlap, you need to meet within the area of overlap for the build-to zone on that corner. So we'll have Lee look at that language. The other provision that's a little confusing is the required 30-foot minimum percentage build-to on each frontage side. So if it's a corner lot, that's both the side street and the primary street.
There was a discussion when Lee was here about parking requirements, and although we're not dealing with that as part of this, somewhere along the line that's going to have to be addressed. What is the intention on that?
Well, I think they will be reviewed as part of this process. We just haven't gotten there yet. So they'll have to be looked at in relation to the changes that we're talking about here. And more broadly, we may be looking at it as it applies to commercial areas. Yeah.
Is there a presumption that, and this is looking at the graphic that's below paragraph 5 on the same page, the presumption is that if you meet that area of overlap requirement plus the 30 feet, which is out in the minimum maximum setback range, that the rest of that building, if it's longer than 30 feet, that it can be beyond that or outside of that setback range.
Which provision are you looking at?
I'm looking at the graphic below paragraph 5.
Oh, okay.
And it shows there that there's the area of overlap then has a measurement of 30 feet on that facade wall. And I wanted to know whether or not the implication is that after you've met that 30-foot requirement, you're free to build the rest of the building outside of the minimum maximum setback range. My belief is it does not, but that needs some clarification.
I think that might depend on the underlying district as well. I think you'll have to look at those figures. Can you bump the slide? Thanks. So height, we've talked about height to death. I'm not really going to kind of go over height too much. I will say that Lee does have in here a top plate height, which is defined as, the measured average grade to the top plate that bears the roof structure. So it's kind of the red line on the average and highest lowest elevation to the top roof line that's there, and how that's calculated. But I noticed throughout the code we have that as an NA in most areas. And we are applying building height, as we talked about a lot, is by stories and feet. And that's, again, the average grade to the highest point of the building. So it would be roof peak. There is an allowance in a provision for a 4-foot height encroachment allowed for parapet walls. So I interpret that as an addition on top of the height for the district? Rick's gonna disagree with me?
No, I'm not going to disagree with you. I just want to sort of put a note in here to Lee, because we had some issues. Within the code now, there's a requirement that any mechanical equipment on the flat roof not be visible from the public right-of-way. So if you're walking along Main Street, you should not be able to look up and see HVAC equipment on the top of the roof. And the parapet has been the primary tool to keep that from happening. I just want to make sure that those provisions are consistent with each other. That enforcement of that provision within the code has been interpreted rather liberally, and I'd like to see that be interpreted more literally, and that these provisions are consistent with the provisions for the HVAC screening.
So as and only if needed to screen, would you be allowed to encroach into that height with a 4-foot parapet?
Well, that's certainly which I suggest you discuss with Lee.
Okay.
Because that becomes a problem. When you say encroachment, you're saying exceeding.
Yep. Yeah, that's...
Encroachment is not a very good term, exceeding.
Encroachment means exceeding, yep.
Is the point of view taken from, I mean, if you're walking adjacent to the building, it'd be one thing looking up, with a parapet. If you're across the street, it would be another thing. Where's that taken from?
For the sight line? What's in the code right now for the sight line? I think it's all sides, including rear abutting properties.
I basically think that, from any public right-of-way or from adjacent residence, that anywhere in that realm, you should not be able to see the HVAC equipment. I'm not sure, Frank, whether or not that's the current interpretation within the code, but I think that's something that certainly needs to be very clear when we talk about this.
Could I interrupt here a second and back up on the parking setbacks? I had a concern with item 3, which says that parking setback applies to the ground story only. If you start getting a parking structure, it can get a conflict between setback and building facade. And if, in a case where the building facade is farther back than where a parking setback would be, can you move the building out? And I don't think that's what we want, so I think that ought to be clarified.
That requirement about rooftop equipment not being visible does not apply to solar panels, does it?
It does in commercial. If it's a commercial building, it's roof mounted, it does apply. In the I believe Brian was telling me this, in the current permit process for solar panels, because it's considered electrical equipment.
Okay, in the current iteration of the solar access law.
In both the solar law that's in draft and the way the building department treats it now, it does apply. So the solar panels have to be screened by a parapet from the right-of-way. Not on commercial buildings, not on a residential sloped roof.
Not on commercial, not on residential?
Sorry, on a commercial building.
Okay.
It doesn't apply to a sloped residential roof.
Right. That could be very limiting, though.
Yes.
Is that something that can be modified?
I'm not sure that we're totally clear here. It sounds to me as though if you have a flat roof commercial building, and you want to put solar panels on the roof, that you have to screen those, as you would if you were going to put an HVAC unit on top of the building. Am I correct?
Yes, that's how Brian has explained it to me.
If you have a residential structure, you're not constrained in that regard. You can put it on a pitched roof.
In front, so you can see it, yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's written in stone or if that can be modified, because that would really greatly restrict the use of solar panels, I think, well, for example, there's a nursery that you see coming off the 33 on, Kensington, area. But the panels are very visible from the street.
Flat roof, I don't think you'll have a conflict, Ellen, because you have that 4-foot parapet, but I agree, if it's not a flat roof, and the current solar law is limiting, those that are visible on something other than a flat roof, yes, that is limiting.
I meant Harlem, not Kensington.
Okay.
I think the last thing up there is the attic space. He has it dictated as 7.5 feet or less is not considered a floor. So that's the half-story that we talk about. That is not calculated into the height.
So just to confirm, so that defines what a half-story is?
Yes,
Because clearly states it's not a full story, but that means it's a half-story.
that's a half-story, but it is habitable space. So minimum height is in here as a placeholder. We haven't discussed it as a committee yet, I don't believe. And Lee had this in the draft. I'm not really going to go into it too much. We don't have to discuss it tonight. We can put a pin in it. But this is what the provisions say. Where dictated, a minimum height of 2 stories is required. And must contain, both stories must contain habitable space. There's also another provision where 20%, only 20% of ground floor area of all the buildings on the lot may be a single story if at least the ground story is 18 feet high, or if the ground story is 24 feet, or the building's 24 feet to the top of the parapet. But that's with 20%, that's only allowing 20% of the ground floor area, so the first story, to do that.
I had a question, maybe a perspective about, I'm looking at the graphic that's associated with item number 6 on page 4-9. And it would seem to me that from the street level, having 2 stories would be appropriate, say in a area like Main Street. But if you look at a 4-story section that would face the residential uses behind it, that building would be very imposing. I'm wondering whether or not that particular provision can be revisited.
We can revisit that.
The best example of this is the building at the corner of Main and I believe it's Fruhoff, where the old Squire on Main restaurant used to be, where the Frame and Save is. That's a 2-story building from the front, and I believe there's a 3rd story in the back because of the slope and the escarpment as it slides back. So it's a good one to look at if you wanted to get an idea what the visual impact of that is. I don't know if it's...
And it's in the process of being sold.
Yeah.
Is that the same building where Squires was and
Yeah.
where
Yep.
framing gallery was?
Yep. Yep.
Up on the screen.
Yeah, there it is right there, yeah, that's the example right there. So, I don't know, I mean, I hear what you're saying, I just don't know whether it's interesting to talk to the folks who live back there. And Alan, I know you're over there, I don't know if you're in this particular area or not, but, can you go around to the back look at it from the residential stuff in the back? See, there's a kind of a transition there, not a healthy one, but...
Are you going to find that all along the escarpment?
No, I don't think so. Very few, my recollection is there's very few buildings that are actually built right on the escarpment like that. They're either above or below it, generally above.
In this particular case, the height is mitigated somewhat by the fact that you have a parking lot behind it.
Right.
So the distance between the back of the building and the adjacent residential use is quite significant.
Right.
If indeed you basically pull that building back farther on the lot, the height may be more significant than this appears to be.
Well,
Visually significant.
or perhaps I guess what you mean is if the parking lot wasn't as deep, clearly, in this, to pull the building back, the building's taking advantage of the topography.
If you have a shallow commercial lot,
Yeah.
backed up to residential, it could be a problem.
Yeah, no, that's true enough.
Yeah, fortunately, we're a flat community. Can we go back to minimum height? We kind of, breeze through that real quick. Very little difference in elevation. Are we going to consider requiring two-story buildings?
It showed up in this code. That's not really
As a
something...
minimum, I mean, if you read two, it says, or a 20% maximum of a one-story. So I'm just, and I apologize, I wasn't here at our last meeting, but...
I haven't been attending these meetings very long, so I don't know if this came up in the past or not. It did show up in the draft that Lee sent us, so I think this is a placeholder from Lee to possibly bring up and discuss.
I think we talked about it at great lengths at the couple of meetings that actually were held at Sweet Home. I remember the conversation, and I thought that we understood the benefit, but we also understood the difficulty in commercially developing like that. So,
Just a perspective, I believe that currently under the traditional neighborhood business district that we require 2 stories. So that's in the code as we speak.
Dave, I know you've talked about this before, and that requirement, I wonder if that's something that constrains the use of that district.
I don't remember the nature of the conversation, but I think I probably would have shared, because we've had that experience in the village when they went to their form-based code, it depends on where we're requiring it and where we're not requiring it. I don't remember the specifics as I sit here tonight. If you got a really small parcel and you have to go 2 stories, it becomes more challenging by the time you meet practical parking requirements, let alone whatever the town's ordinance are. If you got a small site, it's not very deep, how do you accommodate the parking by going up that extra floor? And in addition, you take that first floor on a small site and you have to put in, vertical circulation and other kinds of things that really kind of eat away at the square footage that make that 2-story building on a small parcel really hard to make sense out of. So it devil's in detail, so it just depends on when it's applied. And of course, in any situation where, I guess, an applicant says it doesn't really work here, even if it's not stipulated, they can always try and seek relief from the ZBA if they can make an effective argument. Address every situation to avoid that, but I think, I have to go back. So I made a note here when I was looking at this earlier to make sure I go back and see where it applies and where it doesn't apply, because I just don't remember, since I sit here tonight, where it applies.
I don't know if that gives you the answer you're looking for, Dan, or not.
I'm a proponent of height, and I know there was some concern of the cost associated with creating a faux or a fake second floor. But maybe we can look at the idea of how the scale of adjacent developed properties fall into this necessity for height. And I can't think of a real-life example, but if you had 2 taller buildings and then you had a gap in the middle, you would want to see some consistency, not necessarily at the same height, but you wouldn't want to see something so low that it's out of scale with the adjacent property. So maybe that's how we deal with it. Not necessarily require 2 stories, but deal with adjacent heights for consistency in scale or massing.
I guess what we'll do is we'll talk to Code Studio about that and see how we might facilitate, if we want to facilitate that conversation, and see where we go with it. My sense is that we're talking about some fairly specialized situations, very specific situations.
So transparency is this is where we're getting into more of the architectural details of the building, but this is to really create buildings that are visible and easy to see into. The planning perspective on this is you can better connect as a pedestrian with the building that you're walking by if you can see into the building. It creates more of a engaging streetscape for the pedestrian. And on the walkability scale, people like to look at stuff. We get very bored walking by blank walls and want to see things and look into things and have an interesting streetscape to walk past. And so windows and doors do that, and that's what we're trying to get to with this transparency component.
Where's a young kid supposed to play handball now?
7-Eleven.
I have a continuing concern in terms of the use of the term activation. That doesn't equate to anything that's been in my experience in the past. And I know we've addressed this before, this comment's been made before. I just wonder if isn't something which is more representative of what this actually is all about. And the other thing is, under transparency, item number 3, in the last part of the last sentence is, external reflectance of less than 15%. What in heaven's name is that, and how do you measure it?
That's when you have a reflective surface on the exterior of the window so that they can see out and you can't see in.
So that would be
glass.
External reflective surface of less than 15%. That's what they're saying.
Yes, so you can still reflect to some extent, but you can't reflect more than 15%.
And in a similar question would be, it's great, there's a lot of glass, but then all of a sudden we don't want to go into any specific projects, but all of a sudden a commercial vendor wants to put signage all across that glass, or some other non-transparent film lifestyle images. It's not advertising, though. My point is, a sign's a sign, and is this a place where we should say, we want transparency, it's not just glass, but we want to be able to see in there. We don't want that this glass area be totally covered by decals.
I think it's necessary to have what they call fenestration, meaning, the difference between the solid and what you could see through, or at least the illusion of a glass. I think there may be some instances on back walls. I know Duncan said that we should treat all 4 facades similarly. On a back wall, we might want some glass windows that really aren't functional and you can't see through. Also, with
we do or we don't?
I think we should allow that. Even if it's reflective or smoke color, you can't see through it. And I know, and Alan probably knows this as well, we have some solar panels now that are being hung vertically like windows.
Yep.
And they may be a little more reflective, so I think we may not want to overly restrict ourselves if there is ever an application like that.
I think when we get to the district standards, you'll see that the transparency is only really dictated on the primary and side streets. So the rear facade isn't really dictated. There is another provision in here which is Lee has as a placeholder. It's number 6 on 4-10. And this is where they're talking about the windows must not be opaque by non-operable window treatments. This is something we could probably add in for signage or advertising that's placed in the window.
I think there's going to be another opportunity to address this problem. And is it a problem with the current transparency regulations within the code? And that's when the establishment basically covers the whole window with that film. That's really handled under the sign regulations in the town. So it would seem to me this needs to be addressed there as well as here.
And I just want to point out that the transparency is a minimum percentage, and it's calculated by story. And then we also have the other, in addition to the 15% for reflective, there's an 80% or more of transparency of the glass. So the blank wall length provisions, this really, again, gets into
Lori,
the...
can we go back
Sure.
a second? Is 2 feet high enough? And maybe I'm thinking about this because it's forecast snow tomorrow, even though
When you talk, 2 feet from the ground story?
From the ground story, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, is that... it seems like a rather low. I don't know.
in like a tight sidewalk area where you're in a traditional zone where you're pulling the building up to the street?
I'm just thinking of existing buildings on Main Street and some in Snyder, and I can't think of any that the glass goes down to.
It's a good question, 'cause
Yeah.
you got a durability issue with materials probably up to 3 to 4 feet, because of sidewalks, snow clearing equipment, those kinds of things, so
Mhm.
you're probably right, 2 foot might work great in South Carolina, not very well in upstate New York.
Noted.
Actually, there's some nice masonry elements now that are usually considered the water table, actually greater than 20
Mhm.
granite water.
On blank wall length, again, this is because people have short attention spans and get bored easily walking down the street. It's the easiest way to put it of why planners look to put these into code. They do not include things like windows, doors, or other articulation greater than 12 inches in depth. So if you're trying to kind of add a bump in your building of some sort or a bump out, that's still going to be part of the blank wall unless it's greater than 12 inches in depth. Also, developers can't do this through paint color change. In this blank wall length, these are maximums, and it's going to apply both vertically and horizontally. And the image there is a little deceiving because it's only measuring it horizontally, but in the provision it actually references that it'll be measured vertically as well. And it's going to be applied to stories and street-facing facades, so the street-facing side of the buildings. The last main piece here is the pedestrian access, the entrances, again, generating walkability and interest. This also kind of brings buildings to more of a pedestrian scale if you don't have a giant long wall waiting for that people have to walk along to get inside. These must be operable entrances, and they meet the street-facing requirements. So the percentage, this has to be along the wall that the percentage built to of where those are located. Entrances off the internal street or parking are allowed, but do not count towards your pedestrian access requirement. And then the spacing requirements are not applicable to adjacent buildings, so you can't count your neighbors' doorways and entrances to where your doorway is located. So these are just the general concepts and definitions. We are waiting on the block standards from Code Studio. Next, we wanted to go into more of the actual district to look at some of these min-max metric requirements of these concepts at the district level of what you have. So I'm going to go right into the version that you have. So you have traditional medium scale node 3 and start right with intent. Now the intent section of a code is your general description. Some people like to skim over it. I don't, because it becomes important in legal cases often. When there's a lawsuit and the code is vague, oftentimes judges will go back to what the intent language says. So I just want to put it back in front of the committee to see whether or not you feel that this intent language works, if it's specific enough for this district. And we should be really doing that for every district that we get. So any thoughts on I'll give people a minute.
I'm wondering if the necessity for mixed uses should be in there. I mean, we haven't really delved into that, but, you know, the whole point of this is to encourage multiple uses and mixed uses. I'm wondering if we should get to that within the intent of each area.
I think that was in there originally, and I think...
Everything we've talked about in the way of the comp plan amendment is to be encouraging these areas as either commercial or mixed use So, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you basically want to introduce the notion of mixed use specifically to the intent statement, probably in each one of these. And I suppose the real question is, are there some of these where we wouldn't want to have mixed use, or, you know, so does it apply to all, or are there some instances or some districts where we wouldn't necessarily want to include that? I don't know if we can answer that tonight, but I think it's something we should think about. Certainly that is the intent of the plan amendment, so.
The reason I think it's important, as Lori indicated, that, you know, should something become challenged, let's say we have someone who's really keenly interested in just putting in one particular land use, where we really think it's necessary that there should be some multifamily complementary uses. If the intent is very clear, it could be justification for indicating that you haven't met the intent of that particular zoning district, and that's why we're denying a site plan.
I think the other thing to keep in mind, I know we've had this conversation with Lee in the past, is that while you maybe you're not going to require mixed use, you're requiring a form of building that accommodates mixed use, so it has that versatility and the ability to accommodate and react to economic conditions that might dictate different uses at different times. So I think maybe that's the question. Do you require mixed use, or are you really looking for a form that will accommodate that? And, you know,
going back to just the mixed use part, not the form, if we're applying these new 12 districts to all of the existing commercial districts, there are going to be, you know, not everyone's going to come in and be a large assembly of multiple lots and acreage. People are going to come in one lot at a time, and my goal is to build this shop. And, you know, I don't think we can require it. We just, at least the code needs to be written for the average proposal. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I understand probably trying to, you know, we could say in the intent that we want to encourage mixed use, but I got a feeling that many of the applications that come to the town aren't going to be, it's not going to be anywhere near the landowner's intent. You know, I'm coming in because now I'm building my shop.
I'll make sure I understand, make sure we're reading this all the same way. So when I read the intent for DMSN 3, it's referring to the district. So, yes, it's basically saying if I got multiple stories, I probably got certain uses on the bottom floor and certain uses on the second floor. But, and I don't know if you intended this, it doesn't necessarily mean to apply that each individual building has to have multiple uses on each floor. So I could have one use on the first floor and one use on the second floor, but the district may have multiple retails and services amongst a number of buildings, right? We read it the same way?
That's what I'm looking to be clarified.
Yeah, so this is not applied to a lot, it's applied to a district. Okay.
And I think this is a revision getting to that, because I think there was an earlier version that the staff saw where Lee had outlined mixed, I remember mixed uses being in the sentence and talking about upper story residential. Where we're like, well, what if you wanted the whole building residential because you have a property where you have mixed uses in a secondary building? And I think this was his attempt to fix that. One thing I did pull out of this statement is the last sentence where these districts abut single-family residential areas. A transition is required. What did the committee discuss multifamily for the transitions for abutting if they're outside of the district? So residential just abut residential areas.
Should that statement, a transition is required, is that appropriate for the intent, or should that be put someplace else in the regulations?
I think that's reiterated in the transition section.
We might have had this conversation with Lee. It may not have been in this forum. It may have been on the staff level. And, before we made that change, so ostensibly what we're saying here is, doesn't matter what form of residential, if it abuts a residential district, it must have a transition. And I seem to recall he may have had a suggestion about that. So before we make a conclusion on that, I'd like to talk to him a little bit about that. I understand the intent. But I'd like to have a chance to chat with him a little bit more about that.
Well, I think it's worthwhile talking to him in the meantime, Scott. Townhouses with that single family, but they still require a transition. Right. It's not, and I'm not thinking of those, I'm thinking of the
Well, and Kelly just pointed out that under the transition section in 4-2, there's districts listed for abutting districts of where they would be applied, and none of the multifamily districts are listed here. Any other thoughts on intent? The only other thing that we're discussing also is an intent image, where this might be coming, where you have that 10,000-foot view of what this district might look like. We haven't really gotten pretty far with that discussion yet, so if we decide to go that route, you'll see them. Can you switch to the next? So now we're getting into the details of the traditional medium-scale Node 3, the setbacks. So the setbacks line up with the other traditional elements that Lee has brought up several times. So the Build-To zone is that tighter Build-To area. It's the 5-foot minimum or 15-foot maximum. And you have the bulk of the building up front in that Build-To zone. That's where the primary facade is on the primary street. So 70% minimum for a percentage of the building facade in that Build-To zone. And then for a side street, 40% minimum. And the common lot line, which I think you'll see across a lot of the districts, is 0. So those are your abutting property lines within the node or center, where you can build right up to the common lot line. And the alley is a 5-foot minimum. And for the parking setbacks in traditional, they're deeper than they are in suburban. So what's proposed here is a 25-foot minimum. So really you're pushing the parking to the rear of the property and the side of the building. The side street is a 10-foot minimum. And then the common lot line again is 0 and alley is 5. Any thoughts on that?
5-foot minimum.
A 5-foot minimum for an alley, yes. In a traditional medium scale Node 3, and I will point out that the transition doesn't count. So the transition towards that setback, so the transition would be there first if it's a small lot, and then you would start the distance of that setback, so 5 feet additional on top of the transition.
I was looking at the 5-foot minimum in the Build-To zone, and I'm wondering if there's any way we should talk about the distance between the travel lanes in the street and the building. Not all streets, is there a big area between the edge of the road and the edge of the right-of-way? And that 5 foot might all of a sudden become very small if the edge of the street's very close. I don't know how to write that in here. I just being pessimistic and seeing that somewhere down the line there's going to be a problem where 5 feet's too close to the road.
Well, maybe we should take a look at the areas we've identified to be traditional medium-scale Node 3, or traditional in general, because these are the standards for all the traditional districts, and where those would come into play, and then go from there. A test check, yeah.
These setbacks are off the right away.
Yes. Can you go bulk mass? So getting into the bulk of the building, the top plate has an NA. This one has a typo in it, I crossed it out up there. The building height, as we've assigned it, is 3 stories or 42 feet max for this district. A minimum height isn't applicable, we didn't outline anything. And the street-facing building length is a 200-foot maximum. And then the story height is dictated whether or not it's a residential use or non-residential use by floor. I'm sorry?
How do I interpret the story height?
The story height is if you're using that use, if that use is for residential for that floor, that's where you would, those would be your minimum heights.
2 foot?
Well, ground floor elevation to bring the building up to grade. And then 9-foot minimum. Ground story height's 9-foot minimum. And you could add up your combinations till you reach 42 feet. But it's regulated by stories. You can't go higher than 3 stories. So I've played around with the scenarios with this, and it's quite flexible. I will say for 200-foot max, to give people reference, Spot Coffee and its rear section, that kind of salon building that L's back to the side, that's 200 feet long. Yep, on Main Street in Williamsville, to kind of give people a perspective. Including the salon. Spot Coffee building. And then its back arm, yep. That whole length is 200 feet. So on the activation, again, your windows and doors. For traditional, you have a 50% minimum for the primary street and a 30% minimum for a side street for your ground story. And then the transparency reduces as you go up your floors. On the blank wall maximums, the primary streets for traditional are a 30-foot max blank wall, or the side street is a 50-foot max blank wall. I had concerns about the 50-foot max blank wall for a traditional district, but we'll get into a little bit later there with the frontages that there are some overlay elements that will reduce these. And then the pedestrian access, so it's required, a street-facing entrance is required for both primary and side street in a traditional district, and entrance spacing is 50-foot max and 100-foot max. And then the building elements, these are things that we have gone over: awning, canopy, balcony, gallery, porch, stoop. We don't have any details on these right now. I don't know, are we going to be developing any additional provisions associated with these building elements? And then the overlay frontages that can be applied, and I'll discuss this a little bit more later on, but village, green, and residential frontages can be applied to the traditional district.
The building elements, from the planning board perspective, I would encourage that, because very frankly, at this point, when we look at some of these long buildings, and we're trying, especially when they're very institutional looking, we're trying to encourage them to break up that, look at that building, it'd be necessary to have some divisions in there, so we can put some of these elements in there.
I also know there's a thing going on in the city right now where they're encroaching into the public right-of-way with balconies in a couple buildings, so that's another thing that maybe they want to consider. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail of the suburban districts, more so how they differ from the traditional. I'll give everybody a minute to kind of read over the intent. Again, we don't have photos, we don't have diagrams for the suburban districts yet.
talked about, in the last district, we talked about the last line, where there needs to be a transition between residential areas, whatever, if it's multifamily, any kind of residential or single family. But we just say areas. Is area vague? Should it be adjoining residential development, adjoining residential uses? But if we're saying is required, it becomes a standard, but it's not very specific when it says residential area. Something like that, or use, something, district.
Can we have non-office and non-residential in the upper stories? Because the intent seems to suggest that it might not be desired, such as I have a 4-story medium-scale building and I wish to have personal services on that second floor, salons. Maybe I want to have a niche bar on the second floor or third floor.
Well, the intent references upper stories. As an example, yeah.
I just don't want it to be restrictive. I don't want someone to suggest that I can't have those other mixed uses up there.
Residences, retail. That's a variety of retail for
as well as multi-unit residence or office in office stores. If you read it, that should be all inclusive, that's right.
Yeah, I can see Dan's point though, where essentially it's, everything's all right on the first floor, second floor, but if you get up higher, it's we're only encouraging office or residential. Right, I mean, that's what you said. That was my read on it.
We'll look at that again. So for the building setbacks, going to the suburban district, obviously the build-to zone is increased dramatically. And this is kind of looked at as a base district, where some of these might be tightened up if a frontage is applied. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But in this case, we have a 10-foot minimum to a 90-foot maximum. So this is where it's increased because it's a suburban style district. And for the percentage of building facade, the build-to zone, in the build-to zone, that's going to just decrease to 50% in the, what are you looking for?
Well, this is a little diagram here to follow.
Yeah.
Trying to see what the principles are the same.
They are the same, yeah.
So, if you really want to refer to other, this is much different before.
Didn't our,
Yeah.
didn't our, and I'm right on letter A, the build-to zone, didn't our typologies for suburban, some of them included some parking in front?
Yes.
So with the minimum, 10-foot minimum build-to, maybe I don't understand how build-to works.
It's a giant rectangle. Can you go back to the, it's like instead of having a setback where you say you have to build behind this line and you can build anywhere behind this line, the build-to zone is more of a giant area, rectangle that's shaded in that you have to build the facade within this area. So you just had it, yeah. Be within that area, but only a percentage of it. So this is where in the traditional zones you have the bulk of the building, most of the facade within that build-to zone. But in a suburban district, only 50% has to be of the primary facade. So you'll see that that's how it kind of, in the suburban districts, the way they change these percentages with build-to, the percentage of the building in the primary facade in the build-to zone and the side street zone is much more lenient.
So 50% of the building has to be 10 feet from the road.
Between 10 feet and 90 feet.
Oh, between 10 and 90.
Yes.
Sorry.
Right, it's like, if you look at that rectangle here, that blue rectangle, basically the scale of the physical percentage of that area. All right,
So the shaded A. And this isn't a good picture, obviously, because it's traditional. So that's going to be a huge area for suburban, between 10 and 90 feet. And then the common lot line, again, is 0 foot minimum, and the alley is 5 feet. No, that's not up on the screen. Now, the parking setbacks in the suburban districts, these are reduced because you are allowed to have parking up closer to the street with a 10-foot minimum, so they're reduced down to 10 foot. Remember, in the traditional, they were 25 feet. And the side street's 10 foot as well. And the common lot line, again, is 0 and 5 for alley. So going on to suburban bulk and mass, obviously the building height for this district is 4 stories with 54-foot max. The building mass has increased, so the street-facing building length is 300 feet. To give you reference for this, the Key Bank building is 320 feet long, the one in Eggertsville. Story height, this is kind of explanatory. I'm going to skip ahead to activation. So the transparency, the ground floor transparency for suburban districts is going to be the same as it is for traditional. So it's a 50% minimum for the primary street, 30% minimum for the side street. The upper story is also the same. It's the reduced numbers. It's 20% transparency for primary and 20% transparency for the side street. The blank wall, however, increases because you're getting more into those larger scale, bulkier buildings that can be kind of set back on the lot more. So the primary street blank wall is a 40-foot max, and the side street's a 50-foot max. For pedestrian access, this also increases. You're still required to have a street-facing entrance on both the primary and side street, but the entrance spacing has increased dramatically, up to 80-foot max for the primary street and 100-foot max for the side street. Any thoughts on those? So the buildings and the building elements and frontages are the same. The only thing to note here is that all the suburban districts have an overlay frontage of green and an internal street, which we'll see in the block standards when we get them. So I'm going to jump ahead to Suburban Corridor 3. Does everybody want to take a look at the intent of that language? So it looks like we have some of the same things to address as from the other districts. And I guess we'll be looking at those. Again, the setbacks for Suburban Corridor 3 are very similar. The build-to zone is 10-foot minimum, 90-foot maximum. And but for the percentage of the building of the facade in the primary street build-to zone, it's kind of a mouthful, is reduced to 40% minimum. So this is primarily due because the corridors, if you remember, are shallower lots. So they're being a little bit more lenient in what has to be built up to the street. With the shallow lot? Yes, yes. Well, if you remember in the corridor, the suburban corridor districts, we chose those districts to be corridor and have corridor standards because these lots tend to be shallower, unlike Sheridan Drive.
So this
200 feet or less? Yeah.
Like you see along the boulevard, especially the older section of the boulevard.
Yeah. So sections of the boulevard, sections of Sheridan Drive where the lots aren't very deep. And we created a corridor district to kind of address the shallow lot, but the idea that they have a little bit more of a suburban feel. So they're allowing for that by reducing the percentage build to on the primary street to 40%. And the parking setbacks are also the same as the other suburban districts. So again, you can park in the front. So the primary street setback is 10-foot minimum. Side street setback is 10 foot. Common lot line is 0, and alley is 5. So for suburban corridor 3, the bulk and mass, the height is 3 stories with 42-foot max. The street-facing building length increases again to 400 feet max.
Have we been given a target date for when we'll have the graphics for these districts? Yeah. So I think this discussion would be a lot easier if we had those graphics.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I do have a couple pictures after the end. I didn't get very far at pulling examples up. I have a feeling that the street-facing building length of 400 feet, part of this plays into some of the larger big box that you might find along, like Sheridan Drive.
And allowing 400 is now said the building can't be very deep.
Yes.
You have to get room for parking.
You have to have room for parking, so it's going to kind of regulate itself based on the lot size. Under activation for suburban corridor 3, the ground story transparency is the same, but because it's a corridor and the lots aren't very deep, and it's very auto-oriented, you have the side street transparency drop to 20%. But it's also the transparency stays the same, again, for the upper story, 20% on a primary street and 20% on the side street. And then the blank wall maximums are also the same as the other suburban districts, a 40-foot max and a 50-foot max. For pedestrian access in the corridor district, a street-facing entrance is required on the primary street, but it's not required on the side street. And entrance spacing is an 80-foot max. Again, the same as it was in the other suburban district, but again, they're not requiring side street pedestrian access.
Could I ask a question here? Going back to the transparency part of it, on something like this suburban corridor, if it's abutting a residential area, or some of the others, whether we should put the rear wall, some regulations on it. I think if you think back to the picture that was up here earlier of from across the street where the Squire restaurant is now, that back wall, it's pretty brutal to sit and look at that. Yeah, that, whether it's up there again, that's pretty, it's got some windows at the top floor and some action down at the bottom, but in between it's all just blank. Is that something in the future we should try and consider, something happening when it's facing a residential area?
Where we would require it versus, not leaving it up to the developer?
Yeah. Is that something we want to consider? I think that's a committee issue. It's probably not going to be popular, but it's something that we might want to consider.
Transparency to rear wall, showing residential.
Yeah, really especially on a narrow lot where they're going to be close. This isn't quite as bad, but I think even just to the parking lot, people parking there, you get used to it.
Yeah, I was just looking at it, I think that at one point in time, that parking lot level was white squares, used to be windows. I would be surprised though if at one point in time this was designed to have some sort of commercial activity on the building. Yeah. Which would be below grade from the Main Street side.
If the transition's effective, you don't have to look at it.
Well, that's a good point. especially if it's shallow lot, but we can look at that. To be honest, probably gonna be more case by case basis.
That's the reason, if the transition is low, buffer flow of the wall, landscape is low, this almost works, and then you add some visual change to the windows on the top,
Yeah.
which is what you're gonna see above the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, that observation I just had, it's something that
We should kind of keep that on the table, because it may be something we want to take a look at. It would have some impact on the transition between the buildings on the, facing the major street and any residential uses that were behind. I'm not sure we'd want to encourage have resident, or commercial uses at the back of the building that would face the residential properties. I'm not sure of that, but I think we should keep that in mind and address it at some point in the future.
But if the property was fully surrounded by streets, then the rear of the building would be a side street facing. Yes, and require transparency.
Think of the new hotel on the Tonawanda side of the boulevard. Windows,
That was a big deal. That was a big issue.
So I just want to, can you pull up the frontages thing? So one of the things I wanted to touch on going into the frontages, I'm almost done, I swear. The frontages, after discussions today, are, originally we thought they were something that we could apply as more of an a la carte menu for a developer in some of the districts, and that doesn't seem to be the case. It's really a tool to be used. They're not to be applied everywhere to these districts. So when the traditional medium-scale Node 3 district had village, frontage, green, and residential listed as frontages, those are options that we'll have to outline in a mapping setting. So it's an additional overlay. The frontages are to be treated as overlays on top of the actual base district. So, for example, the traditional medium-scale node district that we looked at and those provisions and metrics that apply to it, that would be the base district you would go with if that was the only thing that applied on the map to your property. But if there are areas within a traditional medium-scale node where we wanted to indicate that you must do a village frontage, which would change some of these dimensions, then we would apply that on the map, on the zoning map. We would call that out. So I wanted to just bring attention to that as we look through these frontages again, because you'll notice that some of the dimensions are different. So for the village frontage build-to zone, it goes from 5 to 15 feet. If we apply it, it goes from 0 to 10. And so the reasoning behind this is that some of these frontages can act as transitions themselves in the streetscape. So you can go from a more of a kind of intense activated streetscape, and as that portion of the street approaches the residential area, you can kind of scale it down to maybe a suburban frontage or green frontage and then a residential frontage, so it blends better heading into the residential neighborhood.
My brain's working at half speed tonight, so I apologize for this question. I had trouble following all of that. But just to make sure I understand, so is this providing the option of these three frontages, or are they going to be prescriptive?
They're going to be prescriptive.
Will that prescription consider, for example, whether or not that particular corridor has power lines and poles running along the side of the street versus the other side that may not?
I think there's two issues.
Such as the south side of Main Street versus the north side of Main Street, this is an example.
One, that other provisions themselves, and then understand that the implementation of this is
I recognize the code section. We can't address every single solitary situation that somebody can come up with in the town. Power lines are a fairly common one because they just occur on every street. They have to exist at some point, right? But
and I think that these should be looked at as an overlay that you would apply only in those areas where you feel like the base district doesn't fit on its own. So it's kind of an additional protection for the abutting properties. So if you didn't have this, or if you didn't have a frontage applied on the map, and it was zoned traditional medium-scale Node 3. All the provisions of traditional medium-scale Node 3 would be applied to that property and nothing else.
Including a frontage requirement.
No. The frontage requirement would be limited to what's in that base district. So it would be where it's placed on the lot.
Well, that's what I
the
meant.
bulk of the building, the transparency, all of that.
There's going to be a standard district with a standard frontage.
Correct.
And if you want to deviate from that, that would have to be actually shown prescriptively on a map that would say, okay, you have a traditional corridor 2.5.
Yes.
But your frontage has to be
Residential.
residential.
That's your choice.
Not just mapping, it's
That's right. My recollection is the first time we've actually considered having a portion of the code use an overlay district. Something new.
I'd just like to back up and get a definition. David used the word, and Rick just used a prescriptive. What is that referring to again? Prescriptive?
What the provisions dictate for what you can do on that property.
And your choice was it what the provisions dictate, or what did you ask?
Prescriptive to me means that the code is telling you precisely what you have to do. You have no flexibility. That's what you have to do. There's no A, B, or C. It's A or B or C. And so I was just trying to ask whether or not these are presented as options, or whether or not I'm being told in any particular lot or district that that's the one you have to use.
Yeah. He is correct. They're only going to be, they're prescriptive, but only where we would apply this frontage on the map.
So, we've looked at however many districts, 69, I think, whatever the number is.
We're going back to the map.
Huh?
We haven't figured that geography
No. Well, we will. I mean, we can finish that with the districts we have. But down the line, a year from now, someone can come in and say, I'm requesting a map amendment. I'm looking to, from whatever district to one of our new 12 districts, how does the overlay get put to that? Does a developer come and say, I'm looking for traditional 3 green? Or does that get...
Go back to the base district, you see there are frontage pipes recommended for those.
Mm-hmm.
Would they have a choice of those?
The concept of the overlay, that's entirely new, and the geography has not been selected yet by staff, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Well,
And it may
there's
not
some
even come
areas
to fruition,
where-
correct?
I'm sorry?
An overlay concept may not even come about? Or are you specifically looking for a way to transition to a smaller scale on a linear basis?
I think what caught us, I guess, slightly off guard is that earlier staff was under the impression that the frontages were to be part of this choice of options that could be applied to those districts, where, in the traditional district it lists those 3. But now it seems that this would be another tool that we could use if we did choose specific locations on the map where we could offer a transition or a ramping down of development to those abutting property owners.
So, for example, Jane Cox has spoken several times about the Snyder area in the Main Street corridor and how the variation in setbacks there, she kind of appreciates that. And she says, well, I'd rather not have, Dave, is that the Karnowski building, the one that we're looking at? This is the one we're looking at here. And I'd rather not have that treatment all the way across Main Street in Snyder. So I think this offers the opportunity to kind of vary that frontage type and achieve some variation and some transition.
It would seem to me if that, once we've gone through this process and established what districts are in what geography and what the frontages would be, and that frontages would be an overlay map, that if a petition came in to rezone the property, that petition would have to specify which frontage they want, as well as which district they want.
Well, if a frontage overlay is even applied there at all, it doesn't mean that these frontage overlays are going to be applied everywhere. It could just have the base district of traditional medium-scale node
Yeah.
4 or 3.
Which brings up another scenario, was that someone could come in with a petition basically to remove the overlay from their parcel, to use the standard one, or to change the overlay to a, let's call it a less restrictive frontage type.
I can see that. I mean, when I look at these frontages, they're not very different from each other.
They may have some implications in terms of a specific parcel. They may present, a different redevelopment problem for someone. That if those frontages or the particular district were changed, it might facilitate a redevelopment process for that particular parcel.
Well, maybe it'll help if we kind of go through the frontages a little bit, just to talk about some of the differences between what the frontage would change the metrics to versus what the underlying district numbers are. So for village frontage, the build-to zone would drop. You're going from 5 to 15 in a traditional zone to a 0 to 10 foot max. And then you're also pushing more of the front facade of the building into that build-to zone, so you're going from 70% to 90%. So this is almost creating a little bit more intense of a village building and how it acts with the streetscape. The parking setbacks would be the same as an underlying zone. The building mass would be set based on the underlying district. For transparency, it's increasing, so you're adding transparency. You're going from 50% to 70%. And the blank wall is dropping. So you're going from 30 or 50 down to 20 feet max. And your entrance spacing is also dropping. So you're going from 50 feet to 40 feet. So I look at this frontage as the areas where we might apply, where we might say, yes, we really only want a village-style building that is much more pedestrian-friendly and closer to the street with all of these features applied in this exact spot.
Yeah, the other thing we need to take into consideration is we've had, like, Main Street expand within its right-of-way, so the amount of right-of-way which is not constructed with basically road and curbing, what have you, that the distances between the curb line and the actual right-of-way line is quite small. So we may have a problem with these.
0 to 10?
Yeah. And it may well be how we measure. Maybe we shouldn't be measuring from the right-of-way. Maybe we should be measuring from a different reference point. It may be the curb line, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah. But we need to take into, I know those situations exist on Main Street where the distance between the right-of-way line and the curb line has been basically reduced each time the road has been approved. You owe me one.
So I throw this image up there just to show that this is your village frontage. This is 116 feet long. The entrances are 30 to 36 feet. The transparency is a bit low, so it would have to be increased. It's a 0 common lot line. There are technically 3 individual buildings here. The setbacks are 5 feet from the front, so it would fit that, and 90% of the primary is primary street facing.
If this example, transparency is low compared to proposed standards, then we gotta be careful that we don't put up too much glass and it looks too urban and we lose the suburban and the village flavor.
I will say this is low if we applied a village frontage for this lot, because the transparency is, 70% minimum? Doors do, if they're glass.
Isn't Why isn't glass that's factored in, or why didn't panels?
I think that the measurement of the frontage, the area of the total, what's glass and what's not.
That's why, yeah, the doors included for that.
If it's a solid door, it doesn't count.
It looks like it's pretty transparent.
I don't remember the actual, the exact percentage number, but I remember it's slightly lower. So on the, can we switch to the next? The green frontage. Now, when you look at this, the metrics that are here for the green frontage, I look at this. This is allowed, mind you, in both the traditional districts and the suburban districts. And so I kind of look at the way this has been changed by Code Studio as it can either be suburban light or traditional green. So it's kind of that in-between frontage of where if you're heading out of a village atmosphere and you want to add into a residential area. In the suburban zones, the build-to zone was 10 to 90, if you remember. So here we're making it 10 to 30. So it's slightly larger than traditional, but smaller than suburban. And the percentage of the building facade in the build-to zone is lower than it would be for traditional, but higher for suburban. The setback is also a bit in the middle, too, for parking setbacks. It's 20-foot minimum. The transparency is the same for ground story. For blank wall, the 30-foot max that's a lower figure for traditional and both suburban. For pedestrian access, the entrance spacing is 100-foot max. This is actually an increase from traditional and suburban, and I wonder if it's a typo, if that was Lee's intent there. So it seems like this is the in-between of what would be a large, big box development and what you would find entering into a village. So here's another example. This is 95 feet long. It's a 30-foot setback. It's side and rear parking. There's 30 feet between the entrances, and 60% is primary street build-to. It's not the prettiest example. On-street parking, yeah, it's on either side of the, and actually in the rear too. I think there's rear parking for this one. So there's parking lots wrap around the building. Yeah. Yeah, and on the street. So with the green frontage, that's where I kind of look at those areas where we've either zoned it, the underlying base district is either suburban or traditional, but it really is kind of in between, and you want to make sure that you don't have a building that's too far back or too far forward or have more green elements. That's just I didn't run the numbers for this one, but, an example of the streetscape evolving as you get into the residential area. Eggertsville Library. So for residential frontage, this is allowed in traditional areas only. And obviously we'd be looking to map these to make sure that they fit. One of the key features to point out here is that these are limited to 40-foot max building length. So you're really looking at small individual buildings. And I posed this question to Code Studio earlier today, and I was confirmed that, yes, the key is to create more of a residential feel, to affect bulk and mass, to make sure the building isn't too large, and that you really have that kind of transition into an abutting residential property. The build-to zone is 10 to 30 feet, so it's same as the green, because you want a little bit of green and landscaping in front of the building, but it's still it's a little bit of an increase from traditional of 5 to 15 feet. The percentage of the building facade in the build-to zone is decreasing to 30%. So I'm going to have to check with Code Studio on this, but I would read this as an intent that the building could actually be turned towards the rear parking lot. You could still have your primary facade that looks residential, but you could have people coming and going from the rear parking lot. Transparency, the ground story can be reduced to 20% minimum. This makes sense because it's supposed to blend in with residential development. And the blank wall reduces to 20-foot max. And again, the entrance spacing is listed as 100-foot max. I think that's a typo for a 40-foot max building. So the example we like to point to all the time for this one is the law firm at the corner of Harlem and Main. So this leads right into, I think there's a jeweler down the way that's also a residential style building, and then you go right into residential housing, and it does transition well.
Are you suggesting that 20-foot blank wall is too much?
No, the entrance spacing, pedestrian access entrance spacing of 100 feet.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Is got to be a typo.
All right, got it.
So I think, this is where we might be looking around the code in bordering areas on the edges of corridors and nodes where we might want to map these areas to require that the frontage in these transition areas is a residential frontage. There's only one more, yeah. That's it for me. I think I'm jumping back in, I'm sorry. When Dan and I had talked about this, I think we just wanted to give everybody an idea, time to digest this. Zoning is pretty difficult to nitpick, so I think you're expecting comments to come in for a while if people find things or red flags come up or you look at it further.
Yeah, since no one has anything else to do between now and the first of the year, I'd like you to scrupulously examine this, and everyone's required to have a minimum of 2 pages of comments. Good comments tonight, good conversation. Again, the intent tonight was really to introduce some of these terms and maybe get you thinking as to what they actually mean. Lori, I appreciate the examples. I think it's always good to see a real-world example what these things look like. You can kind of see it in the street, and it helps to visualize what's going on. But I think what we'd ask is that if you have some time, if you haven't already, or if you want to take some additional time, just think about these concepts a little bit. Understand that each of those different districts that we've identified along the way will have provisions like this, and we'll actually have to drill down into those and make sure that they're what we want them to be, right? That they actually reflect the form of development that we're looking for in each one of those areas. So again, I expect that we'll see a full version of the draft in mid-December. I don't think we'll burden you with that until after the first of the year. Kelly's looking at it. You got nothing else to do, so if you want the code right away, right? That's okay.
When do you want that?
By the end of November, early December, I think I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I don't know what actually, I do have a calendar in front of me. So, December 1st or so would be helpful. We've gone through a couple of these already, provided some comments, some of which were addressed, some of which remain to be addressed by the consultant. But quite honestly, we've expressed to them that we'd just as soon see an entire version of this. It's a little difficult to deal with it piecemeal. So, whatever thoughts you have based on what you've seen so far, we would appreciate it. But I don't think I would lose too much sleep over it. You're going to have another whack at this. And as I think you can tell from the conversation tonight, there's some pretty detailed work that needs to take place here. Again, both in terms of the language and mapping when we get to it. So, I hate to say this, but I think the easy part's over. So, yeah, the plan was the easy part, I think. I think that's all I had. I just wanted to, remind folks that the town board will be considering the FGEIS at their next meeting. I don't know that that's they'll get a copy of it, they'll look at it, and then I guess your decision will come sometime in December on the plan amendment. And, I don't know that there's a reason to meet in December, but I'm gonna leave that up to Dal.
Middle of December, it doesn't make any sense. Not really. I see enough of you the way it is. Although I feel sorry for Rick, he sees more of you than I do, so. Larry, great job. You made it understandable. So probably no meeting in December unless all of a sudden goes to deliver something which we don't expect, so probably January. At this point, public comment? Anybody want to comment from the public? Okay, seeing nobody getting up, I guess we don't have any public comment.
Public hearing closed.
Yes. Yep. All right. Yes, ma'am?
If our next meeting isn't until January, then I would just, would probably say that there would be another appointment from the town board to be the liaison to this committee.
Yes.
So, I just want to say that, I've actually enjoyed working on this committee.
So we enjoyed having you. And if we had singing voices, we'd sing Auld Lang Syne, but since none of us really have a singing voice, we won't do that. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you very much. Hopefully the next liaison is half the person that you are. In the meantime, let's see. Happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and all the other stuff. We'll see you in January.